I was bent over the open engine compartment of an MH-60M Black Hawk in Hangar 7 at Naval Air Station North Island, my hands covered in grease, making final adjustments to a propulsion system modification I had been developing for the past 8 months. It was 14:30 hours on a Wednesday, and the hangar was relatively quiet, most personnel out on training evolutions or afternoon briefings. I wore standard mechanic coveralls with no name tape, no rank insignia, nothing that identified who I was or what I actually did. My hair was pulled back under a regulation cap. I had grease smudges on my face and arms. To anyone walking past, I looked exactly like a civilian contractor mechanic doing routine maintenance work. That appearance was deliberate. I had learned over 15 years that the best way to test modifications in real operational environments was to blend in as someone unremarkable. Someone who wouldn't draw attention or questions. Someone people would walk past without a second glance. Being invisible allowed me to work without interference, without people second-guessing my methods, without the constant supervision that came when personnel knew they were watching someone important. The modification I was installing was elegant in its simplicity, but revolutionary in its impact. A redesigned fuel injection system that would increase the Black Hawk's range by 18% while reducing its thermal signature by 23%. Small improvements on paper, but in special operations where every mile of range and every degree of heat signature mattered, these modifications could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. I had spent 8 months developing the system in my lab, another 4 months testing it in controlled environments. Now I was doing what I always did before approving any modification for operational use, installing it myself, testing it personally, making sure it worked exactly as designed under real-world conditions. Because I had one absolute rule that I never violated. I would never ask an operator to trust their life to equipment I hadn't personally tested and verified. If my modifications failed, if my designs had flaws, operators died. That responsibility weighed on me every single day. So I tested everything myself. Installed critical components with my own hands, flew in aircraft with my modifications, put myself in the same risk I was asking operators to accept. That philosophy had kept me alive and kept my designs reliable for 15 years. It had also meant spending countless hours in hangars and workshops, covered in grease, looking like just another mechanic working on just another aircraft. I was torquing down the final mounting bracket when I heard boots on the concrete floor, moving with the aggressive confidence that usually meant someone was angry about something. I didn't look up immediately, focused on getting the torque specification exactly right. This bracket held a fuel line that would be operating under high pressure. If the torque was off by even a few foot-pounds, it could fail in flight. The boots stopped next to the aircraft. A voice spoke with barely controlled anger. "What the hell are you doing to my bird?" I finished tightening the bracket to specification, verified the torque reading on my wrench, then straightened up and turned to see who was speaking. A SEAL corporal stood there, young, maybe 25, with the physical build and aggressive posture that came from believing he owned every space he entered. His name tape read, Harrison. His face showed anger mixed with territorial protectiveness. I recognized the type immediately. Young operator early in his career, still proving himself, viewing any perceived challenge to his authority or his equipment as a personal threat. I kept my expression neutral and professional. Installing a propulsion system upgrade. It'll be completed within the hour. Harrison's face reddened. "Who authorized you to work on this aircraft? This is my team's bird. Nobody touches it without my approval." I pulled out my tablet and showed him the work order, properly authorized through the appropriate channels, signed by people with the authority to approve modifications to special operations aircraft. Harrison barely glanced at it. "I don't care what your paperwork says. I'm looking at sloppy work and an unauthorized civilian tearing apart my helicopter's engine. You're done. Get your tools and get off this base." I remained calm, recognizing that this situation was escalating in a predictable direction. Corporal, I understand your concern about your aircraft, but I'm authorized to be here, and this work is critical for... I said you're done, Harrison interrupted, his voice getting louder. I'm not going to have some incompetent contractor damage my bird because she doesn't know what she's doing. He pulled out his radio. This is Corporal Harrison in Hangar 7. I need security to escort an unauthorized contractor off base. Female, approximately 35, brown hair, working on aircraft without proper clearance. I could have stopped this immediately. Could have identified myself, shown credentials that would have made Harrison's face go pale with horror. But I had encountered this situation enough times over the years to know that sometimes the teaching moment was more valuable after someone had fully committed to their error. So I stood quietly while Harrison continued his radio call, requesting security, demanding my removal, working himself into righteous anger about protecting his team's equipment from incompetent contractors. 2 other SEALs entered the hangar, drawn by Harrison's loud voice. They assessed the situation quickly, saw what appeared to be their teammate confronting a civilian mechanic who'd been doing unauthorized work. "Problem here, Harrison?" one of them asked. "This contractor was tearing apart our Black Hawk without authorization. I'm having her removed from the base." The second SEAL looked at me with an expression mixing dismissal and mild contempt. "Ma'am, you need to pack up your tools and leave. You can file a complaint about lost work with the Contractor Coordination Office, but you're not authorized to be working on SEAL aircraft." I remained where I was, not moving toward my tools, not preparing to leave. I am authorized. My credentials are in order. This modification is approved and necessary. Harrison stepped closer, his body language becoming more aggressive. "I don't care what you think is approved. I'm telling you to leave, now, before this becomes a bigger problem than it needs to be." I met his eyes with a calm, steady gaze. "Corporal Harrison, I recommend you verify who I am before you continue this conversation. I don't need to verify anything. I can see what's in front of me. A civilian contractor who doesn't know her place and doesn't understand that she doesn't get to make decisions about military aircraft." The third SEAL pulled out his phone, possibly to call additional security or notify his chain of command about the situation. That's when we all heard it. The distinctive sound of rotor blades approaching fast, not the normal traffic pattern that aircraft usually used when approaching the base. This was urgent, direct, coming in low and fast. Through the open hangar door, we could see a Navy helicopter, an MH-60 Romeo, painted in the distinctive markings of a Special Operations Support Unit, coming in for an unscheduled landing on the tarmac directly outside Hangar 7. The helicopter touched down hard, the pilot clearly in a hurry. Before the rotors had even begun to slow, the cockpit door opened and the pilot jumped out, not bothering with normal post-landing procedures. The pilot was a Navy commander, senior officer, wearing a flight suit with patches indicating Special Operations Aviation Command. He ran toward the hangar with obvious urgency, his face showing stress and concern. Harrison and his teammates turned to watch, confused by the irregular landing and the commander's urgent approach. The commander reached the hangar entrance, saw me standing next to the Black Hawk with Harrison and the other SEALs, and his face showed immediate relief mixed with continued urgency. He stopped at the hangar entrance and shouted a single designation that changed everything. Phantom 01. The effect was absolute and instantaneous. Harrison froze completely, his aggressive posture collapsing. His face went from flushed with anger to pale with shock in less than 2 seconds. The other 2 SEALs stopped moving entirely, their expressions showing the dawning realization that they had made a catastrophic error. The commander ran the rest of the way into the hangar, stopping in front of me, slightly out of breath from his sprint from the helicopter. "Ma'am, thank God you're here. We have a situation. Team in Somalia, engine failure on their Black Hawk during extraction. They're 30 minutes from being overrun. We need your authorization to implement emergency field modifications to get them airborne. He handed me a tablet showing real-time data from the aircraft in Somalia, diagnostic information streaming in from halfway around the world. I took the tablet, already analyzing the data, my mind shifting from the confrontation with Harrison to the immediate life-or-death problem demanding my attention. Fuel pump failure in the primary system, I said, reading the diagnostics. Secondary pump is operating but can't maintain sufficient pressure for combat maneuvering. They can hover but can't execute the extraction. The commander nodded. Exactly. We need to know if we can bypass the primary system entirely and reconfigure the secondary to handle full load. But that's not a documented procedure, and nobody wants to authorize it without your clearance. I was already pulling up schematics on the tablet, calculating pressures and flow rates, determining whether the modification was possible and what risks it would carry. Behind me, Harrison stood completely frozen, his brain trying to process what he was hearing. The other two SEALs had taken several steps back, their faces showing they understood they had witnessed something that would define the rest of their careers. The commander noticed them for the first time. Why are there SEALs in here? This is a classified work area. He looked at me, then at Harrison, then back at me, beginning to understand what had happened. Ma'am, were these personnel interfering with your work? Before I could answer, Harrison found his voice, though it came out shaking and hoarse. Sir, I didn't know. I thought she was just a contractor. I was trying to protect my team's aircraft. I told her to leave the base. The commander's face transformed from urgent concern to cold fury in an instant. You did what? Harrison couldn't speak, his mouth opening but no words coming out. The commander turned to me. Ma'am, I apologize for this interruption. Do you need me to deal with this situation, or can it wait until after we resolve the Somalia crisis? I was still analyzing the data, making calculations, determining the safest way to get that aircraft and its crew out of danger. It can wait. Tell the team in Somalia to implement bypass configuration Delta 7. Route all fuel through the secondary system with pressure compensation from the auxiliary reservoir. It'll reduce their maximum speed by 15%, but it'll get them airborne and out of that LZ. The commander immediately relayed my instructions through his radio, reading off the technical specifications I provided. We stood in silence for approximately 90 seconds while the team in Somalia implemented the modifications. Then the commander's radio crackled with confirmation. Phantom 01, this is Hawk 3, modifications complete, engine responding. We're airborne and clear of hostile territory. You just saved 8 operators and 3 assets. Thank you. The commander looked at me with relief and gratitude. Thank you, ma'am. I'll file a full report on the incident and the field modification for documentation. He turned to look at Harrison and the other SEALs, his expression cold. You 3 will remain here until I can notify your commanding officer about what just happened. You attempted to remove the senior aircraft systems engineer for JSOC Special Operations from a classified work area while she was conducting critical modifications. That's going to require some very serious conversations. Harrison looked like he might faint. The other 2 SEALs stood rigid, understanding that their careers had just taken a catastrophic turn. The commander departed, returning to his helicopter to coordinate the Somalia situation. I was left standing in the hangar with 3 young SEALs who were processing the fact that they had just tried to remove Phantom 01 from a base where her work kept operators alive. Phantom 01. The classified designation for the person who designed, modified, and tested every piece of special operations aviation technology that JSOC used. The person whose modifications had saved hundreds of lives over 15 years. The person whose name was known to senior leadership and operators who had been saved by her technology, but who operated so far in the classified shadows that most personnel had never met her or even seen her photograph. And these 3 SEALs had just tried to have her escorted off base as an incompetent contractor. The teaching moment I had anticipated was about to begin. I set the tablet down on my workbench and looked at the 3 SEALs standing in various states of shock and horror. Harrison's face had gone from pale to a grayish color that suggested he might actually be sick. The other two stood rigid, probably running through every word they had said in the past 10 minutes. Let me explain who Phantom 01 actually is, since you clearly don't know, and since your commanding officer will be arriving shortly to have a very different conversation with you, you might as well understand what just happened. I pulled up a schematic on my tablet showing the Black Hawk they had been so protective of. This aircraft, the one you were concerned about me damaging, was designed by me. Not the base model, but every modification that makes it capable of special operations missions. The engine modifications that give it 30% more power, the rotor system that reduces acoustic signature by 40%, the avionics suite that allows it to operate in GPS-denied environments. I zoomed in on specific components. These aren't contractor modifications done by the lowest bidder. These are custom-engineered systems that I personally designed, tested, and certified for operational use. Systems that have kept SEAL teams alive in situations where conventional aircraft would have failed. Harrison tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Ma'am, We had no idea. No, you had no information. But instead of verifying, instead of checking credentials, instead of considering that someone working on a classified aircraft in a secure hangar might be authorized to be there, you made assumptions. You saw a woman in mechanic coveralls and decided she must be incompetent." I walked over to the Black Hawk and pointed to specific modifications. "See this fuel injection system I was installing when you interrupted me? This will increase operational range by 18% and reduce thermal signature by 23%. Those improvements will allow insertion teams to reach targets that are currently beyond safe operating distance. It will make aircraft harder to track with heat-seeking weapons. It will save lives." The second SEAL, whose name tape read Martinez, spoke quietly. "Ma'am, how long have you been doing this work?" 15 years. I started as an aerospace engineer with a defense contractor working on conventional helicopter systems. But I kept seeing operators die because their aircraft couldn't perform in the environments where they needed to operate. So I specialized in special operations aviation, developing modifications that push performance beyond what manufacturers thought was possible. I pulled up my operational history on the tablet, though most of it was heavily redacted. JSOC recruited me 8 years ago when they realized they needed someone who could design, build, and test modifications for operations that officially don't exist. They gave me the designation Phantom 01 and full authority to modify any aircraft in the Special Operations Inventory. The third SEAL, Williams, asked the question they were all thinking. "Ma'am, why were you installing this yourself? Don't you have mechanics who do this work?" "I have teams of excellent mechanics who can install systems I've certified, but I never certify a system until I've personally installed it and tested it under operational conditions. If my modifications fail, operators die. I won't ask anyone to trust their life to something I haven't verified myself." I gestured to the coveralls I was wearing. "So I spend approximately 40% of my time in hangars and workshops, covered in grease, installing and testing modifications. I look like a mechanic because I am a mechanic. I just happen to also be the person who designs the systems I'm installing." Harrison finally found his voice, though it still shook. "Ma'am, I need to apologize. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions based on appearance and I interfered with critical work. There's no excuse for what I did. You're right that there's no excuse. But I want you to understand why what you did was dangerous, beyond just the disrespect and insubordination." I pulled up a mission report on my tablet, one that was partially declassified. 2 years ago, a SEAL team in Afghanistan was conducting an extraction when their Black Hawk took fire. Multiple systems were damaged. The aircraft should have gone down, killed everyone aboard. But modifications I had installed 6 months earlier, redundant hydraulic systems and reinforced transmission components, kept that aircraft flying long enough to reach friendly territory. I showed them photos from the after-action report, showing the damaged aircraft and highlighting the systems that had saved it. Everyone on that aircraft survived because I had spent 3 months designing those modifications, another 2 months testing them, and then personally installed them on 12 Blackhawks operating in that theater. If I had cut corners, if I had certified systems without proper testing, those operators would be dead. The 3 SEALs studied the photos, understanding for the first time the real impact of the work they had interrupted. That's why what you did today wasn't just disrespectful. You attempted to remove me from a hangar where I was installing a modification that will save lives. You interfered with work that directly affects operational readiness and operator safety. You did it based on assumptions about my competence that had no basis in reality. Williams spoke up. "Ma'am, how do we fix this? How do we learn to not make these mistakes? By understanding that capability doesn't announce itself. The most critical work in special operations is often done by people who don't look impressive or important. The person in coveralls might be the engineer who designed your equipment. The quiet person in the corner might be the intelligence analyst who planned your mission. The person you dismiss might be the one keeping you alive." I walked back to the Blackhawk and resumed my work on the fuel injection system. That Blackhawk I just saved in Somalia? It had modifications I installed personally 3 months ago during a deployment to that theater. The bypass configuration I recommended was possible because I had designed redundancy into the fuel system specifically for situations like that. When that commander called me Phantom 01, he wasn't using a cool nickname. He was identifying the person responsible for every system that kept his aircraft and his crews operational. I finished connecting the fuel lines and began the power-up sequence to test the new injection system. You 3 are going to stay here and observe while I complete this installation and run the full test protocol. You're going to see what proper engineering and testing actually looks like. And you're going to learn why making assumptions about people's capabilities based on their appearance is a vulnerability that compromises operations. Harrison stepped closer, his earlier aggression completely gone. "Ma'am, will we face disciplinary action for what happened? That depends on whether you learn from it. I don't destroy careers over mistakes made from ignorance, but I also won't tolerate people who can't learn, who can't question their own assumptions, who can't recognize that they might be wrong." I ran the first diagnostic test on the fuel injection system, monitoring pressure readings and flow rates. Your commanding officer is going to be here shortly. He's going to be very unhappy about what happened. But I'm going to recommend that instead of formal discipline, you 3 be assigned to work with me for the next 72 hours. You'll assist with installations, observe testing procedures, and learn why the work I do matters. The 3 SEALs exchanged glances, understanding this was both an opportunity and a test. Martinez spoke carefully. "Ma'am, we accept. We want to learn. We want to understand why we were wrong." "Good. Because over the next 3 days, you're going to see exactly what Phantom 01 does. You're going to watch me test modifications that could kill me if they fail. You're going to see how I verify every system before I let operators trust their lives to it. And you're going to learn that the person you underestimate might be the person keeping you alive." The fuel injection system powered up successfully, all readings within acceptable parameters. The modification was performing exactly as designed. I pulled up the test flight schedule on my tablet. In 2 hours, I'm taking this Blackhawk up for a full performance test. High-altitude operations, maximum speed runs, emergency maneuvers. I'll be pushing every system to its limits to verify the modifications work under stress. Harrison looked at the aircraft, then at me. "Ma'am, you test fly your own modifications?" "Always. I won't ask a pilot to fly an aircraft with untested systems. If something fails during testing, it fails with me aboard, not with an operator who trusted my work. That's remarkable commitment. It's basic responsibility. I design systems that people trust with their lives. Testing those systems myself is the minimum standard I can accept." My phone buzzed with a message from the base commander. "En route to Hangar 7. ETA 10 minutes. Commander Jackson briefed me on the situation. We need to discuss. I looked at the 3 SEALs. Your commanding officer will be here in 10 minutes. I'm going to recommend the 72-hour training assignment. What happens after that depends on whether you demonstrate genuine learning or just performance to avoid consequences. Williams asked quietly, "Ma'am, can I ask why you're giving us this chance? You could end our careers right now. Why teach us instead? Because I've spent 15 years being underestimated, being dismissed, being told I didn't belong in spaces where my work was critical. I learned to use that dismissal as an advantage, as a way to work without interference. But I also learned that some people can learn from their mistakes if given the opportunity." I cleaned the grease from my hands with a shop towel. You 3 made a mistake born from assumption and bias. But you weren't malicious. You thought you were protecting your team's equipment. That instinct is good even if your execution was catastrophically wrong. So I'm giving you the chance to learn why your assumptions were dangerous and how to see more clearly in the future. Harrison stepped forward. "Ma'am, thank you. We won't waste this opportunity. Don't thank me yet. The next 72 hours are going to challenge everything you think you know about who does important work and what that work looks like. Some people can't handle having their assumptions shattered. We'll see if you're among them." The sound of vehicles approaching signaled the arrival of the base commander and likely their SEAL team leadership. The teaching moment was about to expand beyond just these 3 young operators, and I was going to make sure everyone involved understood exactly why Phantom 01 operated in the shadows, why assumptions were dangerous, and why the most critical work was often done by people nobody noticed. The base commander arrived with 2 other senior officers, including the SEAL's commanding officer, a lieutenant commander whose face showed he had already been briefed on what happened and was not happy about it. I straightened from my work on the Black Hawk and nodded to the arriving officers. The 3 corporals came to rigid attention, looking like they were facing a firing squad. The base commander, Captain Richardson, spoke first. "Ma'am, I apologize for this incident. It should never have happened. These personnel will face appropriate disciplinary action." I held up a hand. "Captain, I'd like to propose an alternative to formal discipline. These 3 made a mistake based on assumption and incomplete information. I think they can learn from it if given proper instruction." Richardson looked skeptical but gestured for me to continue. "I want them assigned to me for 72 hours. They'll assist with installations, observe testing procedures, and learn why the work I do matters. At the end of that period, we'll assess whether they've genuinely learned or just performed to avoid consequences." The SEAL's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Parks, spoke up. "Ma'am, with respect, these men attempted to have you removed from a classified work area. They interfered with critical modifications. That warrants more than educational opportunity. It warrants education that prevents future incidents," I replied. "Formal discipline will punish these 3 but won't change the underlying problem. Teaching them, and through them teaching others, creates actual value." Parks looked at his 3 corporals, then back at me. "What happens if they don't learn? If this is just performance? Then they wash out and face the formal consequences they avoided initially. But I've spent 15 years being underestimated by people who made the same assumptions these 3 made. Some of those people learned, some didn't. I'm willing to invest 72 hours to find out which category these operators fall into." Richardson nodded slowly. "Your recommendation carries significant weight, ma'am. If you believe this approach serves operational effectiveness better than formal discipline, I'll support it." He turned to Parks. "Your men are assigned to Phantom 01 for 72 hours starting immediately. Full cooperation, full attention, 0 complaints. Understood?" Parks nodded. "Understood, sir." The senior officers departed, leaving me with 3 corporals who understood they had just been given an opportunity they didn't deserve and couldn't afford to waste. I returned to the Black Hawk and gestured for them to approach. "For the next 3 days, you're going to see what I actually do. Not the legend, not the stories, but the real work. You'll assist with installations, observe test procedures, and learn why every decision I make matters. Harrison spoke hesitantly. Ma'am, where do we start? We start by finishing this fuel injection system installation. Harrison, you're going to help me run the final connections. Martinez, you'll monitor diagnostic readings. Williams, you'll document every step for the technical manual. Over the next 4 hours, I walked them through completing the installation. I explained every component, every connection, every specification. I showed them why torque values mattered, why routing paths were specific, why redundancies were built into critical systems. Harrison, who had started the day aggressively protecting his aircraft, worked carefully and precisely, asking questions when he didn't understand something, taking direction without ego. By 1800 hours, the installation was complete. I ran the full diagnostic suite, verifying every parameter was within specification. Now comes the critical part, test flight. I'm taking this bird up for 2 hours of performance testing. You three will observe from the ground, monitoring telemetry, and learning what proper flight testing looks like. Williams asked carefully. Ma'am, you said you test fly every modification yourself. Why? Don't you have test pilots? I am a test pilot, qualified on 7 different aircraft types. But more importantly, if something I designed fails in flight, I need to be the one experiencing that failure. I need to understand exactly what went wrong so I can fix it. I won't ask another pilot to take that risk for me. I walked toward the pilot equipment room. During this test flight, I'll be pushing this aircraft to its operational limits. Maximum speed, maximum altitude, emergency maneuvers, everything that would stress the new fuel system. If anything fails, if any component doesn't perform as designed, I need to know before this aircraft gets assigned to an operational team. Martinez spoke up. Ma'am, what happens if something does fail during testing? Then I deal with it. I've had 3 emergency landings over 15 years from systems that didn't perform as expected. Each time taught me something that made the next design better. That's why I test personally. The risk teaches lessons you can't learn any other way. I changed into flight gear while the 3 corporals prepared the monitoring station. 20 minutes later, I was in the pilot's seat running pre-flight checks while they watched telemetry from the ground station. The test flight lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. I pushed the Black Hawk through every maneuver in the test protocol. High-altitude operations at 15,000 feet. Maximum speed runs at 180 knots. Emergency maneuvers that stress the airframe and propulsion systems. Simulated combat scenarios that required rapid acceleration and aggressive maneuvering. The new fuel injection system performed flawlessly. Every parameter stayed within specifications. The increased range was verified. The reduced thermal signature was confirmed through onboard sensors. I landed smoothly and shut down systems, satisfied that the modification was ready for operational certification. The 3 corporals met me as I exited the aircraft. Ma'am, Harrison said, his voice showing genuine awe, that was the most aggressive flying I've ever witnessed. You pushed that bird harder than any pilot I've seen. That's the point. If it can handle what I just did, it can handle anything an operational pilot will throw at it. If it had failed during any of those maneuvers, we'd know the design needed work before it got installed on aircraft carrying operators. Over the next 2 days, I took them through the full range of my work. Design sessions where I calculated performance parameters and engineered solutions to operational challenges. Workshop time where I fabricated custom components. Installation work on 3 different aircraft types. And more test flights where they observed me validating modifications under operational conditions. On the 2nd day, I showed them something most people never saw. My personal workshop where I built prototype systems. This is where actual innovation happens, not in corporate design labs or contractor facilities. Here, where I can experiment without bureaucracy, where I can test ideas that might fail, where I can push boundaries, because I'm the only one at risk if something goes wrong. The workshop was filled with partially assembled systems, test rigs, diagnostic equipment, and prototypes in various stages of development. Williams looked around with obvious fascination. "Ma'am, how many modifications have you developed in this space?" 47 over the past 8 years. Some were minor improvements, some were revolutionary changes that transformed how special operations aviation works. All of them started here, with me building and testing alone until I was confident enough to move to operational aircraft. I showed them a prototype I was currently developing. This is a next-generation engine monitoring system that will predict failures before they happen. Current systems tell you when something is wrong. This system will tell you when something is about to go wrong, giving pilots time to abort missions before catastrophic failures occur. Martinez studied the prototype carefully. "Ma'am, this would save lives. When will it be operational?" "When I'm absolutely certain it works perfectly. I've been developing it for 18 months. It'll probably be another 6 months before I'm confident enough to install it on an operational aircraft. I won't rush innovation when lives depend on reliability." On the third day, I took them to a secure facility where I kept records of every modification I had ever made and every operational outcome. This is the real measure of my work, not the designs or the test flights, the actual operational results. I pulled up mission reports showing how modifications had performed in combat environments, aircraft that had survived damage that should have been catastrophic, systems that had operated in conditions that exceeded design specifications, operators who had returned safely because redundancies I had engineered gave them options when primary systems failed. Harrison read through report after report, his expression showing growing understanding. "Ma'am, these modifications, they're not just improvements. They're the difference between operators living and dying." "Exactly. That's why I test everything personally, why I don't cut corners, why I won't certify a system until I'm absolutely confident it will perform when operators need it most." I pulled up one specific report. "Remember that Somalia situation from yesterday? That field modification I authorized? That was possible because 3 months ago, I spent a week in Somalia personally installing upgraded fuel systems on aircraft operating in that theater. I knew exactly what configuration would work because I had designed and tested it myself." Williams spoke quietly. "Ma'am, you've saved hundreds of lives with your work. I've kept operators alive by making their aircraft more capable and more reliable. That's my job. That's why Phantom 01 exists. Not for recognition or glory, but to push aviation technology beyond what manufacturers think is possible, so operators can accomplish missions that shouldn't be possible." At the end of 72 hours, I sat with the 3 corporals for a final evaluation. "Tell me what you learned." Harrison spoke first. "Ma'am, I learned that critical work doesn't always look impressive. You were covered in grease, installing a fuel system, looking like any mechanic. But that work was more important than anything I've done in my career. I learned that I judged you by appearance instead of understanding what you were actually doing." Martinez added, "I learned that real expertise means taking personal responsibility for your work. You don't design systems and hand them off to others. You test them yourself. You risk yourself. You take ownership of every outcome. That level of commitment is what makes the difference between adequate and exceptional." Williams concluded, "I learned that being underestimated can be an advantage. You operate without recognition, without people knowing who you are, because that allows you to work without interference. The anonymity isn't a limitation. It's what makes your work possible." I nodded, satisfied that the lessons had taken root. "You came here 3 days ago making assumptions about my competence based on my appearance. You're leaving with an understanding of why those assumptions were dangerous. Some of you will internalize this lesson. Some will forget it as soon as you return to your teams. That's your choice." I stood, "But I want you to remember something. Every person you encounter might be more than they appear. The person in coveralls might be the engineer keeping you alive. The quiet person in the corner might be the analyst planning your mission. The person you dismiss might be the one who determines whether you come home or not. Harrison spoke for all three. Ma'am, we'll remember, and we'll teach others. This lesson is too important to forget. I walked them to the hangar exit. The Black Hawk you were so protective of 3 days ago? It's now certified for operational use with the new fuel injection system. It'll be assigned to a team next week, and when they fly missions that succeed because of increased range or reduced signature, they probably won't know why their aircraft performed better than expected. That's fine. Recognition isn't why I do this work. I looked at them one final time. Now get back to your team. And the next time you see someone working on aircraft, ask yourself if you really know who they are and what they're capable of before you make assumptions. The 3 corporals saluted and departed. I returned to my work. More modifications to design, more systems to test, more aircraft to upgrade. The endless cycle of innovation and validation that had defined my career for 15 years. Phantom 01, the designation that carried responsibility for keeping operators alive through better technology. The name that most personnel would never know belonged to someone they might walk past in a hangar without a second glance. That anonymity was exactly what allowed me to do my work. And 3 young SEALs had just learned why underestimating people based on appearance was a mistake they would never make again. 2 years after that incident in Hangar 7, I received a message that changed how I understood the impact of those 72 hours. Harrison, now a petty officer, had been deployed to Syria conducting operations with his SEAL team. Their Black Hawk had taken heavy fire during an extraction, sustaining damage that should have been catastrophic. But modifications I had installed 9 months earlier, reinforced transmission components, and redundant hydraulic systems, had kept the aircraft flying long enough to reach friendly territory. His message was brief. Ma'am, your modifications saved 8 operators and 4 assets today. Aircraft took hits that should have brought us down. We made it because of your work. Thank you for testing systems you weren't willing to ask us to trust blindly. Harrison. I saved that message in a folder with dozens of others like it. Operators whose lives had been saved by modifications I had designed, tested, and certified over 15 years. Each message represented missions that succeeded. People who came home, families that didn't receive devastating notifications. That was the real measure of my work. Not the technical specifications or the performance improvements. The operators who survived because I had spent months designing systems, weeks testing them, and hours installing them personally. Martinez had transitioned out of field operations and into engineering liaison work, serving as a bridge between operators and technical developers. He told me he showed every new engineer the same lesson I had taught him, that the person using your equipment trusts you with their life, so you owe them the commitment to test everything yourself before asking them to depend on it. Williams had become an instructor teaching equipment reliability and maintenance to SEAL candidates. He used my workshop as an example of what real commitment looked like, explaining that the best engineers didn't just design systems, they built them, tested them, and took personal responsibility for every outcome. The cultural shift I had hoped for was happening. More engineers were testing their own work. More operators were respecting technical personnel. More people understood that critical work often looked unremarkable. 3 months ago, I received an unusual request from JSOC Command. They wanted me to brief senior leadership on special operations, aviation innovation. Not the technical details, but the philosophy and methodology that had produced 15 years of successful modifications. I stood in front of 3-star and 4-star officers from every branch, explaining why I operated the way I did. Phantom 01 exists because special operations requires aviation capabilities that exceed what manufacturers can provide. My job is to push those boundaries, but I do it with one absolute rule. I will never ask an operator to trust equipment I haven't personally tested and verified. I showed them footage of test flights where I had pushed, aircraft to their limits, photos of me installing systems in hangars, data showing how modifications had performed in operational environments. A 3-star general asked the question I had been waiting for. Why do you personally do installation and testing work? Don't you have teams for that? I do have teams, excellent teams, but I won't certify systems for operational use until I've installed them myself and flown aircraft with those systems under stress conditions. If my designs fail, operators die. That responsibility requires personal verification, not delegation. Another general observed, that level of personal commitment is unusual in modern military contracting. I'm not a contractor in the traditional sense. I'm Phantom 01. I exist to keep operators alive through better technology. That mission requires taking the same risks I'm asking them to take. After the briefing, the senior officers authorized expansion of my methodology across other technical specialties. More engineers would be required to test their own work. More emphasis would be placed on personal responsibility over bureaucratic process. 6 months ago, I was working in a hangar at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan when a young female engineer approached me hesitantly. "Ma'am, are you Phantom 01? I looked up from the engine I was working on, covered in grease as usual. "I am." She pulled out a tablet showing technical designs. "Ma'am, I'm developing an improved cooling system for helicopters operating in high-temperature environments. I've heard about your methodology, about how you test everything personally. I wanted to ask your advice." I wiped my hands and looked at her designs. They were good, innovative, but untested. "Have you built a prototype yet?" "Not yet. I was planning to contract that out." "Don't. Build it yourself, install it yourself, test it yourself. If it fails, you need to be the one who experiences that failure so you understand exactly what went wrong." The young engineer looked uncertain. "Ma'am, I'm not a mechanic or a pilot. I don't have those skills." "Then learn them." "I'm an engineer who became a mechanic and a pilot because my work required it. Your designs will never be as good as they could be if you don't understand how they perform in real operational conditions." She thought about that for a moment. "Ma'am, can I ask why you operate this way? Why you take on so much personal risk?" "Because 15 years ago, I designed a system that failed in flight. A test pilot nearly died because of my error. I realized then that if I wasn't willing to risk myself testing my designs, I had no business asking others to trust them. I returned to my work on the engine. Build your prototype, install it yourself, test it under operational conditions. When you're absolutely confident it works, then certify it for operational use. That's how you honor the operators who will depend on your work." 2 months later, that engineer sent me a message with photos of her. Prototype cooling system installed on a test aircraft. She had learned to do the installation work herself. She was scheduling test flights where she would be aboard evaluating performance. She was becoming what Phantom 01 represented, an engineer who took personal responsibility for keeping operators alive. Last week, I completed my final test flight before a scheduled transition. At 52 years old, after 15 years as Phantom 01, I was moving to a different role. Training the next generation of engineers, institutionalizing the methodology that had kept operators alive for a decade and a half. My successor had already been selected. A former Special Operations Forces pilot who had become an aerospace engineer specifically because he wanted to improve the aircraft he had flown in combat. He understood the operator's perspective and the engineer's responsibility. He would carry the designation Phantom 01 forward. But before I transitioned, I returned to Naval Air Station North Island one final time, to Hangar 7, where it had all started with 3 young SEALs who had tried to have me removed for incompetent work. Harrison was there, now a chief petty officer. He had requested to be present when I conducted my final test flight. "Ma'am," he said as I prepared the aircraft, "I wanted to thank you, not just for teaching me that lesson 2 years ago, for everything you've done to keep operators like me alive. Your work matters more than most people will ever know. The work continues without me," I said. Your aircraft will keep getting better. New modifications will keep pushing capabilities forward. Phantom 01 is a designation, not a person. It will outlive me. Martinez and Williams arrived as well, both having requested leave to be present for this moment. Williams spoke for all three. "Ma'am, we tell your story to every new operator and engineer we meet. The lesson about assumptions, about commitment, about what real responsibility looks like. You changed how we see technical work and the people who do it." I completed my pre-flight checks and prepared to taxi out for the final test flight of my career. Before I departed, I looked at the three of them one last time. That day, 2 years ago, when you tried to have me removed from this hangar, that taught me something too. It showed me that even after years of operating in anonymity, I could still be completely dismissed by people who judged capability by appearance. That lesson reminded me why I do this work the way I do it. Being underestimated is an advantage that allows me to work without interference. Harrison smiled slightly. "Ma'am, nobody who knows the name Phantom 01 will ever underestimate you again." "Good. But there will always be people who don't know that name, who see a woman in coveralls working on an aircraft and make assumptions. That's fine. That anonymity is what allows this work to continue." I climbed into the cockpit and ran the final systems check. The test flight was perfect. The aircraft performed flawlessly. Every modification I had installed over 15 years had been validated one last time. When I landed and shut down systems, I sat in the cockpit for a moment, reflecting on everything that had led to this point. 15 years of designing systems, installing modifications, testing aircraft, taking personal responsibility for keeping operators alive. Hundreds of missions where my work had made the difference between success and failure. Thousands of operators who had returned safely because their aircraft had performed beyond normal specifications. That was the legacy of Phantom 01. Not recognition or awards, not fame or acknowledgement, but operators who came home alive because someone had taken personal responsibility for making their aircraft better. As I walked away from that Black Hawk for the final time, I knew the work would continue. My successor would carry the designation forward. New engineers would learn the methodology. Future modifications would keep pushing capabilities beyond what people thought possible. And somewhere, a young engineer would be working alone in a hangar, covered in grease, testing systems personally before certifying them for operational use. They would look unremarkable. People would walk past without noticing. But that engineer would be carrying forward the same commitment, the same responsibility, the same understanding that if you design systems operators trust with their lives, you owe them the commitment to test those systems yourself. That was the real legacy, not what I had accomplished personally, but what I had taught others about responsibility, commitment, and the understanding that critical work often looked completely unremarkable. Phantom 01 would continue. The designation would outlive me, and operators would keep coming home because engineers understood that their work required personal risk, personal testing, and personal responsibility for every outcome. That was worth 15 years of anonymity, worth being underestimated, worth every hour spent in hangars looking like just another mechanic. Because in the end, the measure of success wasn't personal recognition. It was operators who survived because someone had cared enough to test systems personally before asking them to trust those systems with their lives. The work would continue, the mission would evolve, and the legend of Phantom 01 would remain as a reminder that the most critical work was often done by people nobody noticed, until the moment that work saved lives. Then everyone understood why anonymity was an advantage, why testing personally mattered, and why the person in coveralls might be the most important person on the base.